Thank you so much for being here at our 9th Standing in the Gap. Bernie and I were just whispering to each other, all of our favorite people are here. So thank you so much. As some of you know, I grew up in the mountains of North Carolina in a small town, literally on the edge of Pisgah National Forest. My dad was pastor of a church that was dead in the center of town. Many of his parishioners were retirees who had come from large East Coast cities and retired in the mountains of North Carolina. And one such retiree was a man named Mr. Olivier. After Mr. Olivier lived a long, lovely life, he passed away and wanted his service and burial to be in the mountains of North Carolina. His sisters, his elegant sisters from Philadelphia, were very concerned that us mountain folk might not be able to give him a sophisticated enough burial. Well, the funeral went off without a hitch. And as my father recessed out of the church, followed by the pallbearers carrying this very simple wooden casket, my dad said to himself, now that was a dignified service. As soon as Dad thought that, he was startled by this loud cracking noise like a thunderclap. He swirled around only to discover that Mr. Olivier's wooden casket had literally split in the middle, and Mr. Olivier was rolling down the stone steps in front of the church. It's okay to laugh. Now, what could be less dignified than that? Turns out the funeral home had dressed Mr. Olivier from the waist up. So things don't always turn out the way we hope they will. Despite our best intentions, the gap between those who have what they need to fulfill their potential and those who do not, that gap has, in fact, widened over the last 9 years. Not only does this ever-widening gap isolate those of us who have so much more than we need, and not only does it beat down the hopes and dreams of those who have so much less than they need to fulfill their potential, but as The Economist points out, this widening inequality is detrimental to the entire world's economy. So this morning, I would like to name 4 specific gaps we all can help close, and in so doing, help to create a world in which everyone knows their life matters. The first gap is between our surface self and our true self. For roughly the first 30 years of our lives, we construct an ego, a self-image that is largely shaped by our perceptions of what others think is important and acceptable. The development of this surface self or separate self is essential to healthy development. But there comes a time in our development for moving more deeply into what some of us call our true self, that place of unconditional love in us, and it is in everybody. That place that is not motivated by external accomplishments or approval from others. Some of us are held hostage by the demands of the surface self long past what is healthy for us or our communities. What often helps to shift one from living from the surface self to living from that more authentic self, what often helps to shift us is suffering. Suffering and some kind of interconnecting practice, like prayer, meditation, yoga. Closely related, the second gap we need to close is the gap between our minds, bodies, and spirits. When there is a need to escape the tyranny of our own minds, even to the detriment of our bodies and spirits, we develop unhealthy habits and often dependencies on control, security, approval, and a host of sensations that we use to numb the pain of our disconnection, like drugs and alcohol, sex without intimacy, shopping, gambling, internet porn, and even excessive working. And I always try not to look at Bernie when I say that. This struggle to stay present to our current reality instead of sleepwalking through life is the human condition. In addition to the struggle, which is the human condition, 9 out of 10 of the 350 to 400 members of Recovery Café have experienced early childhood trauma, undiagnosed mental illness, and grinding poverty. Their substance use most often began as an attempt to medicate the pain of an undiagnosed chemical imbalance in their brains. It is so much easier to blame the addict for moral failings than it is to create systems and structures in which even those who have suffered poverty, trauma, and mental illness can heal and fulfill their potential. And yet, so many of you in this room have been instrumental in creating the healing structure which is Recovery Café. Our gratitude is truly too deep to express. The third gap that we can work toward closing is the gap between our smaller circle of family and friends and the larger human family. One of my favorite African-American mystics, who was an influence on Gandhi, wrote, "There are few things more devastating than to have it burned into you that you do not count." This sense of powerlessness is key to the maintenance of any system of economic, racial, and social control, a system in which some have been disinherited. There is much excitement in the philanthropic community over the concepts of sustainability and scalability. I can't wait to write about the strides Recovery Café is making in these areas in our next newsletter. Our challenge, though, is to hold in creative tension the enthusiasm for sustainability and scalability and Paul Farmer's caution not to let the demand for sustainability become a blunt instrument used against the poor. One individual said to me, "I believe with all my heart that people need a place to heal, like Recovery Café. But I don't want Recovery Café to depend on my contribution. I want it to become sustainable through broader community resources." I totally understand that. We have been told by experts in the field, some of whom are here today, that Recovery Café's model needs to be attached to and funded by wider systems in every community across the nation. I totally understand that none of us wants others to depend on us. It makes us responsible and vulnerable. But in truth, at the deepest level, we are dependent on each other. Our destinies are tied up with the destinies of others. We cannot become all we were created to become when others in our community have no hope of becoming all they were created to become. There is a oneness in the human family that we deny at our own peril and at the risk of losing our very souls. Even as Recovery Café connects with broader resources, I know it will always depend on the kindness and generosity of people like you in this room. We cannot turn our backs on the most vulnerable in our communities, even when we feel burned out on fundraising breakfasts and overwhelmed by the need. Every one of us depends upon the kindness and contributions of others, even if we think we are making it totally on our own. Which brings me to the fourth and final gap that we can seek to bridge in ourselves, and in so doing participate in the healing of our divided world. We can seek to bridge the gap between our denial and acceptance of our own death. If we stay in the process of the death of our surface separate self, we will have less fear and few regrets when the final death comes along. The death of the surface separate self is the death of that self which seeks more and more of what doesn't work and can never satisfy our deepest longing. It's the death of the self that maintains the illusion of separateness, the illusion that we are separate from people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different races, different religions, different political persuasions, and different sexual orientations. It is the death of our inability to face the broken places within ourselves and to fully claim and offer our gifts on behalf of the whole human family. Gordon Cosby, who was like a father to me, died this past March at the age of 95. He had devoted the past 70 years of his life to changing systems and creating structures of healing and hope in Washington, D.C. A couple of months before his death, I went to D.C. to spend time with him, and it ended up being our last time together. Gordon shared, I kept sensing I was being called to this new vision. So I prayed, God, I am 95 years old. I can't even stand up. I can't lead this initiative. But I felt God's response to me was, Gordon, you still have influence. Use whatever influence you have for the suffering poor. Gordon understood that all that is not given is lost. That only what we invest in love will last beyond our brief lives on this earth. That it is in giving our lives for the sake and the healing of our divided world that we, in fact, find life joyful and overflowing. Thanks again so much for being here.